The world feels a bit toxic and blah these days, doesn't it? The same old people coming up with the same old solutions for big problems that still don't work. We need to change the game. Well, welcome to Women Advancing. Join me, host Kate Byrne, in this dynamic bi-weekly podcast, bringing together female founders, funders, and thought leaders. Listen to the people driving change, how they got there, how you can help, and yep, how you might just be the next one to advance. Proof that all ships rise with women at the helm. That's what happens when Women Advance with Kate Byrne. Hey everyone, it's Kate Byrne, your host. Today we're going to tackle a topic that affects all of us. Why the heck are we so busy, yet we never feel like we're getting anything done, let alone enough done? My guest is Brigid Schulte. She's a best-selling author and award-winning journalist, and she's the director of the Better Life Lab at New America. She's got two great books. One, Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time, and the other is Overworked. It unpacks this modern obsession that we have with busyness and why our relationship with work desperately needs a reset. So yeah, we're going to take a look at the future of work. We're going to cover the difference between busyness and real productivity, how men and women experience time differently. Yeah, both at work and pleasure, and what that means for work and life balance. The future of work, what's broken, what's changing, and what needs to happen next. We're going to hear what the ideal workplace for Brigid looks like. And lastly, we're going to take a little time and get some practical tips on how can you reclaim your time, your focus, and meaning in an always-on culture. So if you're like me and you feel way too stretched too thin, and you're buried in to-do lists, which are like anchors weighing you down, or wondering, is this just how life is now? Is it ever going to change? Come on in. We're going to show you some ways that, yes, you can have that life. And here's how you do it. So excited to welcome Brigid Schulte, New York Times best-selling author for her book, Overwhelmed, and soon to be on the New York Times best-selling list. Overworked, I bet. And fabulous journalist. Welcome to Women Advancing.
Thank you so much for being here. It's what I've dedicated my life to, so I'm thrilled to be in this conversation.
We were just saying to each other, and I think it's so true, such an important subject, quite honestly, especially in these times when people are monitoring what we can and cannot speak to. And now more than ever, I really kind of want to galvanize people to stand up and speak truth to power. And this is going to be one of the conversations that I think is going to play a huge role. So let's jump in really quickly.
Right.
Before we jump into the book itself and the subject of overwork, which is amazing, time in life, how did you get to where you are? Like, what made you go, boom, this is what I want to do. Here's what I'm supposed to be writing about. Shazam, I'm on my way.
Okay, well, it was never like that. I would say it was a lot of feeling very lost and a lot of wandering and a lot of late night anxiety and wondering what's the purpose and what am I doing with my life.
Yep.
But in general, I think it was always asking the question, why am I here? What am I doing? What should I be doing? What speaks to me? And always being open, when I could calm down enough to listen. I'm very anxious and spend a lot of time really, we're here for a short period of time on earth and how do I make the most of it? And I think I was always, I'm one of four daughters, raised by, a very, very conservative, kind of patriarchal dad. That my brother-in-law says we were more afraid of our dad than we were of God. We were raised Roman Catholic, so that tells you something. And so I was raised with very strict ideas of who I was and what I could do and what I could be. And I always bristled against that, even as a kid. I liken it to sort of, we'd go on these long driving trips. I grew up in Oregon. My parents are from Wyoming, and we would drive from Oregon to Wyoming. Oh my God, in an air-conditioned station wagon for 2 days of utter hell. Praying the rosary along the way. But I just always remember being in the back seat and feeling like nobody ever told me where we were going, when we would stop, feeling totally powerless. And hating that feeling. And so I think that a lot of what fuels me is the sense that women get to be people too. That, it's not just men who are smart It's not just men who can make choices about what they do with their lives. It's not just men who,
Right.
have more opportunity to live kind of a rich and full life. I was expected to either, get married and have children or be a nun, kind of Roman Catholic. And that was kind of it. Maybe
Mm.
when I was working on my first book, I actually interviewed both of my parents and it was shocking. Even my mother bought into that and said
Wow.
things to me like, I said, well, I always thought that, my dad worked in higher education. And I said, I thought that education was always so important to you, that you wanted us to be educated. And my mom said, well, we always thought that would be a good backup, just in case
Oh my gosh, a backup?
a backup. And I mean, look, I'm older than a lot of folks, but I mean, I graduated from college in 1984. It wasn't sort of the 1950s. So I was like, wow, a backup for like, just in case I didn't do the quote unquote right thing. And so I think that's a long way of saying the reason that I am where I am and I get up every morning and I'm just so passionate about what I do. If feminism is really about the personhood of women, that's what I'm all about. And it's
Right.
not, it's sort of like Black Lives Matter. It's like, we didn't say anybody else's lives didn't matter. It's just that, when you look at statistics, Black lives are more targeted and more affected by police violence. It's the same thing when I think about gender equality. It's not just women's advancement that I want to see. I want to see all of us have to have the opportunity for a more human future. And so part of what I do is I look at men and I tell the stories of how they get involved in care and caregiving, things that were always seen as quote unquote the women's sphere or women's work
Right.
and sort of invisible and diminished. And part of what I'm trying to do is elevate the value of that care. And I know we'll get into the book, but one of the big arguments that I make in this new book is that we need to think about work in a much bigger way. And it is not just what we do for pay in the marketplace, but it is also all of the unpaid work of care and home and all of that. Everything that is not leisure time is work. And all of that work should be good and fair and kind of well represented. And so that's a lot of what I'm passionate about is just making the world a more human place.
Exactly. Okay, so I'm gonna do this a little different. Let's start with the gender work and the notion of time.
Mm.
And then I think we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into this whole culture of overwork and busyness, and then talking a bit about some tips that you might have how could reclaim time and well-being. So
Yes, I
without
do.
further ado, I know your research, which is amazing at that, it actually found that women experience time differently than men.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
It's so fascinating. But when you
Yeah.
think about it, you know, time is always it's a constant, there's always going to be 24 hours in a day, but how we experience time can be very different. And that the perceptions that we have of our experience of time often is far realer than, kind of clock time. I mean, I think we've all had experiences when a day feels like it lasts forever. It's like, oh, it's only 3 o'clock. This is amazing. Or a day like yesterday with,
Yes.
daylight savings time where you're just like, wait a minute. I just feel like I just got up and now the day's almost over. So we've had those experiences where time itself doesn't shift, but our experience of it changes for a variety of reasons. And when it comes to gender, this is what's so fascinating. And it's not so much that I research this, but there are fascinating researchers out there, and they write these amazing white papers that nobody sees. And so I think that's part of my role is I read those amazing white papers, and then I help other people, help bring other people to it. And so what some of these researchers found is because we have these very traditional gender roles, we have these cultural expectations about who we are and what we should do and and how we should spend our time. We have this sort of programming, these kind of movies that run in our heads. And for women, the movie is, I better put other people first. If I'm a caregiver, that's my role. That's the most important thing. If I take time for myself, I'm selfish. I'm a bad person. And for men, the movie that runs in their mind is, boy, I better get a good job. I better support my family. I better make a lot of money because that's where I'm going to show my success and status. So we've got, even if you may be aware of them, you may not be, but we've all got these sort of like messages consciously or unconsciously kind of, you know, knocking at the door of our brain all of the time, if you will. And so what was fascinating is these researchers found that, say, a family could be sitting around a dinner table and it could look from the outside like everybody's having the same experience. And yet, when you asked people how they felt about it, men would often feel like, I'm amazing because look at me. I am home having dinner with my family. I have put my family first. I have left the office and I'm amazing. And so they would be feeling this great sense of pride
Right.
that they were sort of sacrificing, if you will, their
Yep.
identity to put their family first. And if you asked a woman, like a mother, how she was feeling, it was often like, oh my God, I didn't do enough at work. Oh my God, I'm a terrible mother. Oh my God, the bread is burned. Oh my God, I didn't do this. Oh my God, I'm not
Flog,
spending enough time
flog,
with their
flog,
children.
flog.
You are just exactly. And you are feeling like garbage. It's really interesting. This one, this one researcher just said, so for so many women, the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about ourselves in time is just polluted. And it's actually called contaminated time because we are just so hard on ourselves from the get go. And a lot of it is because of these unconscious messages that we don't even recognize.
That we're doing. I mean, is the same true, that same sort of difference the same true for, well, like, when we have leisure time?
Oh, that's the
That's probably double time
Oh,
flogging.
it's even more. It's even more. There was a really fascinating study, and I read about it in my first book. And my first book is what led to my second book, and it really looked a lot at leisure time, which in the United States as a whole, because we tend to be a very work focused culture, we
Right.
don't give a whole lot of credence to leisure or play or time off. We tend to think we value busyness, we value productivity. If you have a weekend when you didn't like fold the laundry and then bake bread and then do this and do that and like take your kids a million different places and
Right.
work out twice a day, then you feel like a total loser. That sense of leisure and just reflection is not something we value in this society. So you've already got those messages coming in. And then there was this one fascinating study that I wrote about in the first book that asked women all around the globe about leisure time. And what they found is that men, they feel like they get leisure time. Golf, I think, is a perfect example of that.
Yep.
Like I'm going to go all day and I'm going to walk around and hit a ball and be with my buddies and drink beer.
Right.
And they feel that that they're owed that, that is just part of being alive. Whereas for women, it fascinating. It didn't matter what country women were in. It didn't matter what profession they were in. And I consider, if you're an at-home parent, that's a profession because it's a lot of work, whether you're paid or not, so it didn't matter what women were doing. It didn't matter your race, your religion, your socioeconomic status. Women felt that they did not deserve leisure time, that they had to earn it. And the only way to earn it was to get through the end of this endless to-do list that, as we all know, never ends. And so,
Right.
and listen, I've experienced that. And that was a lot of what I wrote about in the first book that sort of like drove this second book. You have, women's time also tends to be very interrupted. Throughout history, women's time is far more interrupted, whereas men have more protected time. And you
Mhm.
think about it, like the secretary would be always interrupted to protect the boss, the man's time.
Interesting. You're right. It's
Yeah.
precious time. His don't. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. We treat men's time like diamonds and women's time like sand, that it's just
Wow.
not valuable, that their time is valuable. So women have always had this sort of, you know, this interruption. And what we know from like peak human experience, to get into that flow state requires long stretches of uninterrupted time. Well, that's very difficult. Just women tend to not have it. And then if they do have it, they tend to feel guilty about it. And I've seen myself do this. You'll get like a little bit of a stretch of time and like,
Yep.
oh my God, what am I going to do? I could read a book. I could play the piano. I could go for a walk. I better clean out the junk drawer. And so then you go to the next task and then you add 5 more things onto your task list. And so part of what, my work is, I like to say I work at the intersection of personal transformation and systems change, because we've got to understand the waters that we're swimming in and begin to make different choices, even in how we think. And then that can help us be part of making larger, bigger change.
Beautifully put. So, how the heck did we get here? Like, how did we start glorifying busyness? Is it because we're addicted to adrenaline? Is it because that's how we show our worth? I mean, how do we find ourselves here as a society in general?
It is such a good question. And it is I would say not uniquely, but it's a peculiarly or particularly American trait.
This is what I was going to ask too, is how does it compare? I mean, I've worked with a few other countries and it does not seem they don't have this to this degree.
Not to this degree,
To
and
this degree.
some of it is, I would say that there is a speed up with technology that people, and there is more pressure, time pressure that people around the globe are feeling. But there's a real difference in the United States. And part of it is you think about, it's sort of, we're an immigrant culture. There's a restlessness. People come here for a better life. You're going to make your life better for your kids. And so you work really hard. That was sort of the American bargain, right? You would work really hard. You'd reach the quote unquote American dream. And if you didn't, at least your kids would. And I think
Yes.
that's what's fueling a lot of resentment and anger right now, is that that's not the case. That's not happening. And that's part of what I explore in the second book. But to go back to that sense of like, why busyness? So there is sort of a restlessness in American culture to begin with.
Right.
But it's really interesting. There was a time when, like in the 50s, when people, or even the 60s, people would come home for dinner. You really did.
Oh, yeah, you did.
You
Yeah.
work 9 to 5. If you're a mom, even if you're an at-home mom, I mean, I love my mom, but man, she'd go off on a coffee clutch and you were left on your own. I mean, we got locked out of the house, when we got home from school. I mean, somebody would call protective services today, but that's just what you did. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
I lost track of time. I was playing bridge. So there was time, it was a different, and certainly that's a middle class experience. It's not universal. But what's ended up happening is there's been a ratcheting up of expectations. And you can really see that in the time use data, starting in about the 1980s.
Yeah.
So this was long before we all had like a smartphone in our pockets. There was this sort of expectation that at work, that you would work really long hours, and that
And this was this ideal worker myth?
this ideal worker really began to take hold you really see it in the data in the 1980s. There's
Yep.
something that happened, and nobody really knows why. And there's a couple different theories. And since we're talking about women, one of the theories that I find very interesting and intriguing is that women entered the workforce en masse in the 1970s. Now, if when you look at the data, now there's been so much stigma around that. Oh, mean, bad working mommies, and they're selfish, and they're like, abandoning their children, and da 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 da. But if you really look at the data, that's the time when the economy started to change and really good jobs started to go overseas because they're so expensive here. And the reason they're so expensive is because we don't have universal health care. So when you expect an employer to pay for your health care, it makes your job really expensive compared to like, Mexico, or where,
Right.
this, global South, where a
Okay.
lot of the jobs
Yeah.
went. So the middle class started to be hollowed out. Good jobs started to disappear. Wages started to stagnate. And so you needed a second earner to go into the paid workforce just to maintain the status quo of your family. And so that's a big part of what I'm trying to do, is sort of help people see that myth of the mean, bad working mom was just that. It was a myth. Because if women had not gone to work, and her data shows that far more families would have fallen into poverty, abject poverty, if women hadn't worked. So, I bring that up because it's important to like have that historical perspective, to reclaim the past in order to be able to like claim the future, if you will.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
to me,
So I'm sorry, I'm going way off, but
no. But I think this is interesting. It's important to have the context, the comprehensive context, because so often all of this happens in response
Yeah,
to the situation at hand, and really to your health and livelihood of your home,
exactly.
of those your tribe.
So what ended up happening is, women enter the workforce en masse in the 70s. And then think about it. By the 80s, you've been in the workforce for 10 years. You're ready for promotions. You're ready to compete. One of the theories about why we got so busy and where overwork came from is that leaders, and they're still today, largely men, largely white men, who are in 70% of all C-suite jobs are men. Far more men are still in power. So what ended up happening is you move the goalposts and you make it harder for women who are still carrying most of the care responsibilities. You make it almost impossible for them to compete. Because if I'm supposed to put in long work hours and I'm expected to be the primary caregiver, you just can't. You are pulled impossibly in two different directions. And so that's part of what I explore is how can we change work cultures so that you get back to what's really essential, which is doing good work rather than the performance of work, which then keeps just men in power. How do you change work? How do you change cultural expectations around care? How do we value it and how do we share it more fairly? How do we shift public policies, which are so completely not only punishing, but punitive for families and caregivers? How can we shift public policy, shift workplace practice, shift cultural attitudes to get us to that more egalitarian future where there is the opportunity to live a full human, wholehearted life?
So for those listening who, are trying to figure out how do I make my work culture and my place be healthy and just a reciprocal give get, I guess, in one sense. What are one or two steps that these leaders could take that would help this workplace shift take place? I mean, is it go beyond just, flexible hours, or what would you suggest?
So I would say two things. So if you're a leader, I'll tell you there's more that you can do. But for everyday folks, which most of us are,
Yeah.
you know, so let's start on the personal level because that's really where we live. Start
Right.
where you are. Start where you are. And so what I would say is like take a pause. Take time to pause. It seems impossible. You're like running on all cylinders. I have no time. There's research that shows that if you stop and take even 3 deep breaths, your cortisol levels drop. And when you do that and you get out of that sort of fight or flight, freak out, panic, anxiety, kind of frame of mind, you can begin to see a little bit bigger picture. There's behavioral scientists call it tunneling. And when we
Ah,
feel that scarcity of time and kind of like running around in a panic and busyness, and we got to answer all these emails and we got to get to meetings, and oh my God, my Slack channel is dinging and the kids need this and da da da. When you get in that freaked out frame of mind, there's research that shows your IQ actually drops 13 points. Think about a tunnel, you narrow your vision and you
yeah.
can only see like a few steps ahead of you in the darkness. You can't, so you don't know where you're going. You're just sort of groping along in the darkness. And so that's where those 3 breaths, that kind of like learning to pause, just interrupting that cycle of busyness can help you begin to get outside the tunnel, begin to ask questions. Well, wait a minute. Do I really need to do this? Who's telling me this? Whose voice is this? Is this what I really need? Or is this what I think I'm expected to do? And, it's
Mm.
going to take a while, but get into the practice of interrupting that busyness and asking yourself questions. Is this really what's most important to me in this moment? And think about your to-do list in a very different way. I think one of the most transformative things somebody ever told me is your to-do list is a brain dump. Get it all out of your head, write it down, put it in your notes, whatever you do, whatever, app you use, so that you don't have to expend energy thinking about it, trying to remember. But
Mhm.
then don't do the next thing and think, well, I got to do it all and I better do it all by the end of the day. From that dump, pick one thing. What is the one most important thing to do that day and schedule time to do it? Well,
Mm.
I was part of a research project looking at overwork and like, why were people like feeling so busy and overworked? And it was fascinating. We talked to people and like, I was running around all day and I was busy all day and I never made time or didn't get to that one thing I really needed to do. So they end up taking work home. They end up, working over the weekends and then they get tired and resentful and exhausted and the work feels like a slog. And so figure out what that one thing is and put it in your calendar. Make sure that people don't schedule you into meetings over that time. We tend to assume that the work is going to get done, and it often doesn't. So create that space. And, the last thing I'll say in terms of personal transformation, again, listen, I love doing this work because I get to learn as I do it because I'm learning, I'm learning as I go. Another behavioral scientist told me the best thing to think about in terms of your calendar because we have these busyness expectations, we tend to think, oh my God, if I cram my calendar just filled with stuff and I'm back to back to back in meetings, look at me, I'm amazing. Like we get like you say, an adrenaline charge out of it. And yet at the end of the day, it's like you look back, well, what did I do? You're not quite sure. And like, did I produce anything? Did I enjoy anything? Is any of this aligned with my sense of purpose? And oftentimes it's not. So again, take that pause, do your brain dump, pick the one, maybe three things, and then treat your calendar not like a pantry that you got to cram filled with stuff so that when you open the door, it all falls down on you. Treat it like an art gallery. So what is your one thing? Hang it on the wall. Make sure there's white space so you prepare for it beforehand, like I did before our interview. Kind of breathe, prepare, you know, spend time in that moment. How many of us go to a meeting and we're answering emails? And so you're half listening and half writing an email, and you're really kind of nowhere. And, you're not doing yourself any favors. You can't multitask. You're task switching. You're taxing your brain too much. And people can tell you're not really there. So be fully present in what you've committed to. And then make sure that there's time, there's white space afterwards to process, to follow up on whatever you need to do. And then take a breath and go on to the next painting. So that's what I would say on a personal level. And that begins to slow the busyness down. That begins to help you really get clear on what your priorities are. And then I would say in a busyness culture, especially for women, it's very important that you communicate that you show your output, you show your value, and you communicate it. Because just because you're not there at 8 o'clock at night, and just because you're not the one that's sending emails at 11 o'clock at night, do not apologize for that. Do not make excuses for that. Show well, this is really important to our team. And these were the deliverables we agreed on. And I made progress on all these. Don't make it about time. That's an old factory model of thinking. Make it about what you've done and make it about the value so that people can't argue. It's like, well, she wasn't here late at night, so she's not committed. It's like, oh my God, look at this amazing thing that she did. She's amazing. So begin to change the frame around you that way.
Right. I can remember it was my first job at Gray Advertising. And I remember there was this one account supervisor, and you would always see him walking, meandering throughout the halls all day long. And then he would stay, then he'd finally sit down. It took him forever to write this letter, which then I eventually had to write the letter. And what I realized was, and he was always, oh yeah, I'm burning the midnight oil. Well, literally, you're doing that because you're walking away the day. And I really took it as, oof, you're totally wasting time. That was my first glimpse into this kind of sick, twisted, vantage point of it's like, no, you're literally inefficient at what you're doing.
It's really true. And we reward the wrong things. And we tend to think, okay, well, if you're a business leader and you're CEO and you're thinking about profits, certainly you must be making good decisions. Well, you're not. I got to tell you, one of the most shocking things in reporting my most recent book was just the power of leadership belief, mindset. And it had nothing to do oftentimes with evidence or data or even experience. It had everything to do with well, I work this way, so everybody else should. It's sort of this adherence to the status quo because it's familiar. And you see that in all of these arguments about return to office and no more flexibility. And I need to see you if you're going to be working. What that is, it shows a real lack of imagination. It shows a real lack of trust and an inability to communicate. And it's a really old style way of working that doesn't suit anybody for the 21st century. And it's all about what we believe. So this is what I would say, you're saying, what do you do? That's the individual. Now let's go if you're a team leader or if you are a leader and you have some kind of organizational role, there is a lot that you can do. Even if you're not if you're the CEO, you can do an awful lot, to set the tone. But what I would argue, it's interesting. I spent time in Iceland looking at the short work hours movement, which I have to say, I was a real skeptic of at first. It's because I tend to work too much. I take on too much on my plate. I mean, I have a whole chapter on workaholism, that I struggle with workaholic tendencies.
Don't we all?
For a variety of reasons. I have to say, I was like, nah, there's no way you can do it. And I came away convinced, looking at really successful work redesigns, looking at really successful short work hours movements. And what they do, anybody could do. It doesn't matter that it's Iceland and their, gender equality is amazing and they only have 4 hours of sunlight. That's not the point. The point is that there is a process you can go through. You can do it as an individual. You can do it as a team leader. And that is, again, first you start with the pause. take a deep breath. You've got all these status quo systems that you've been doing. It's like, status quo way of working. What everyone had to do to move to shorter work hours is get really clear on, well, what is your work? What is most important? What creates the most value? And I began to think of work in three ways, and that's sort of the center, and that's really where we should be spending our time. That's where we should be spending our focus. That's really where we get our sense of meaning, identity, and fulfillment when you're doing that value added work. But then there's a second concentric circle around it that I call the work around the work. And that's where we get into tunneling. It's the meetings and the emails and the Slack and the Asana and all the stuff that should be directing you to doing more of that, should be helping you to do that
Right.
complicated
Yep.
work.
Yep.
But oftentimes it's like a merry-go-round and we get stuck there and it doesn't support that deeper work. And then there's the final concentric circle I call the performance of work, like your boss walking around, or like, you've seen it. My husband used to talk about this guy at the newspaper where he used to work years ago. And he was like, yeah, this guy, he was always running around slamming doors and like looking really busy and looking really hairy. And nobody had any idea what he did, because it was performing busyness. So that if you were in a culture, an ideal worker culture that rewards long hours and looking busy and the appearance of busyness, you're going to reward that person who appears busy and puts in long work hours. And this is where it's really important as a leader to go through that process of like, what's our work? How do the systems layer up so that we can focus on that work? How do we measure it so that I know you're doing good work and I can trust you to do that good work? And it doesn't really matter when, where, or how you do it, because this is the output that I want, that we all want. This is the expectation, the standard that I want you to meet. And this is the deadline. And if you can meet that, that's work in the 21st century. It's not sitting in a butt in a chair, and it's also really important. I know we're talking in sort of a professional setting, but also most women, I mean, the lowest wage work, 2/3 of those jobs are done by women. So it's really important that we transform hourly work if we really care about gender equality. And there's a way to do that as well.
Mm.
Really focus on what's important, reward it, pay it well, have regular hours, not these irregular, nutty schedules. There's a way that you can also include more control and say over your schedule. If you have to go into a place, you might not have location flexibility, but you can have time flexibility. There's a way to make work better all across the board.
I love that. So, is what you just described, if you could redesign the modern workplace from scratch, what would it look like? With all of that in mind.
It would be output oriented. It would be focused on your performance and the output. It would not be about input. It would not be about time, manner, or place of work. It would be a lot about trust and communication.
Mm.
And I think the most important thing is to make it human centered. That human beings are not widgets. They get sick. They need paid time off to care for people. Those are rights. Those are not fringe benefits, and when you trust and believe in your people, that's when you're going to get innovation and amazing work. It's really interesting. I was talking to a lot of people who look at how to make, kind of crummy jobs. We've got a lot of crummy jobs, how to make crummy jobs better jobs. And a lot of what they say is like, you get what you expect. So if
Yeah.
you treat people like they're going to, not want to
Cheat you.
work and they're going to cheat you and they're lazy, you might get that. But if you treat people like, this is a great job, I'm going to treat you well. There's a reason why you're here. There's a pathway to advancement. I'm going to connect you to the purpose of why we're here. So you understand, like if you're cleaning a hospital room, you doing that is vital for these patients to be able to heal, like your job is important. I guess what I think about when I think about designing really effective and equitable work for the 21st century, and it's all about the Protestant work ethic. And we tend to think it's like, oh, work till you drop and you're going to get your reward in the next life, which is the Protestant work ethic that we've sort of adopted in the United States and in the UK. But at the same time, there was this different Protestant work ethic or work ethic that was forming, and people just ignored those writings. And what those writings said is that they called it the equality of callings, that all jobs had value and that all jobs, it was sort of like, or all work had value, whether it was paid or unpaid. So that it was very feminist in the sense that it really recognized the value of care work. It recognized the value of what we do to make a home and to raise children and to care for elderly people or disabled people. That's a beautiful and important work. And what they imagined that society was sort of like this very intricate clock, and every gear had value. And so every gear deserved to be treated well, to not have a toxic boss, to
Right.
have a sort of a floor that you wouldn't fall underneath. And I guess that's what I think about is how can we be both not only effective, but equitable and make those opportunities far more available to far more people.
I work there.
Me too.
So, what advice would you give your younger self, knowing what you know now?
Oh, that's such a good one. I guess don't worry so much.
Mm,
I was just so racked with anxiety. And not a lot of people are. Maybe I was just sort of programmed that way, but I do. And I think I worry too much. And boy, just yeah, enjoy your life while you're in it. Because I got to the point where I would look back, it's like, oh, that was such a nice time. Why was I so like wrapped up with like worry and it wasn't enough and I wasn't enough at the time? So I guess that's what I would just say is like, just breathe and be in the moment and let it be enough.
yeah, because I really will say the 3 deep breaths, that's a family favorite of mine, and it does a great job in keeping you here
Yeah.
and present. Because when you start future tripping, you don't even know. You only know what you know then. You're not even there yet. There's all these other things that could happen or not.
Right.
And yes, and more often than not, half those things never even ever even pop up.
That's
And
right.
so where do you see the greatest opportunity for women moving forward?
Oh boy. Well, I want to acknowledge that this is a very difficult time right now.
Yeah,
Um,
agreed.
and I think that there's a lot of discouragement and even despair. And I have been despairing. You read Project 2025, it's very despairing. It's very much, wanting to recreate a world that actually never really existed, kind of like the Leave It to Beaver families, which
Yep.
if you really look at the data, that really was only true for like maybe a decade or two, like after the Second World War, and really only true for white families of the middle class.
Yep.
It's not really how most people have lived throughout human history. So I think this is where it's important. People who control the present control the past. And if you control the past or memories of the past, you control the future. So I think the most important thing is to be aware of the fullness and the complexity of the present and the past, and then work together for a much different, fuller, wholehearted, open, equitable future. I think that
Yeah.
the real opportunity now is, you know, eh, embracing complexity and the truth and continuing to tell it and not being gaslit even at the highest levels.
That's what I was gonna say, adding truth to power and literally and trusting each other.
Yeah.
I think the more we all, but especially women with women, can help lift other women
Yeah.
and not slip back into that situation that I think those of us who did grow up in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, early workplaces, you know, you'll get there. I mean, you will, or you'll end up somewhere else, but wherever you end up, you'll be prepared for it. So don't take away from someone else. And maybe when someone does get elevated and lifted and promoted, see that as, oh, cool, that's a reflection of what's possible for me, as opposed to, damn, they got my seat.
Yeah. It's that scarcity mentality.
Yep.
And that is what, sadly, that is what has pitted women against each other. The sense that there's only one, or that the ladder is so narrow that there isn't enough room. And so I think that the most important thing is don't buy into that. That's a myth. It's a lie,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be the way it is.
Right.
The way things were, the way things are, does not have to be the way things will be. And I
Ex-
think that was what's so exciting about some of the reporting that I've done. I focus on bright spots. I focus on change agents. And there's a lot of very cool stuff happening out there, that doesn't get necessarily picked up in the mainstream press because I think right now everybody's so whipsawed. But you know what? It is out there. And so look for those places of hope and inspiration Do not sink into despair. Learn from each other. And I think you're absolutely right. The more, the more, the more, there isn't a zero sum game. When we all do well, we all do better,
Yeah.
so keep that in mind.
Yeah. No, so true. You and I are going to have a second episode, and then we're going to go for it again. But seriously, Brigid, thank you so, so much, both for making the time here, but really for bringing this, shining a bright, bright light on everything. And frankly, helping us all put the flog down and a little bit of a reality check. And if nothing else, to take a moment to pause and take those 3 deep breaths.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say, somebody once asked me, what's your favorite time management tip? Because I got
Ah,
lots of them, and I love them. But you know what my favorite one is? Compassion. Be compassionate. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fail. You know what? Just pick yourself up and begin again. No judgment. You can't love and care for other people unless you love and care for yourself. And I think that's a message women really need to hear.
And I think that is a lovely note to end on, because I'm going to need to practice that later on today.
Well,
But
good. Me too. Me too.
but thank you, thank you. I really appreciate your time and your wisdom.
Well, I'm working on the wisdom, but I'm happy to share the time. It's been wonderful to be in community with you.
Awesome. All right. Take care.
Thanks. You too.
Wow. I don't know about you. So many takeaways from that conversation with Brigid. I guess one thing that stuck out is it's really fascinating to me how the different ways that men and women actually experience time and leisure time. And that in some ways, women actually think of time as contaminated. And the way that Eve Rodsky so beautifully put that men treat time like diamonds and women treat it like sand. And Bridget's suggestion that we actually take a look at a calendar and we treat it like an art gallery where we hang one beautiful piece, one beautiful project, and we give it space as opposed to cluttering it all over the place and jamming up the entire wall. The notion and the practice of asking yourself, is this what I need to do? Or is this what I think I need to do? That alone is going to clear a lot on my calendar. And then finally, the notion of taking a pause and taking 3 deep breaths. So take 3 deep breaths and jump back into your day. Thanks for making time to spend time with us. Till next time.
Thanks for listening. May this episode inspire you to move forward. Be sure to go to iTunes, Spotify, katebyrne.co, that's KATEBYRNE.co, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and listen to even more episodes. Here's to strong women. May we know them, may we be them, may we raise them. And be sure to meet them on the next Women Advancing. Ta till next time.